charged with providing some thoughts, stimulating some discussion, and providing our own perspective on this topic. So with that in mind, I'm going to take the first stab at this. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Kate Smith. I work on a lot of tobacco control work here at the school. My background is as a sociologist, and I'm going to talk today about the role that the media play, both advertising media and a little bit about news media, and think about how we understand e-cigarettes in relation to the issues around tobacco use and tobacco control, and think about sort of currently how are we being pushed to think about this issue. And both David Holtgrave and David Abrams at the beginning of this session really set out very nicely why it's so critical that we think about e-cigarettes and think about it now. And as a sociologist who comes from the background, the sort of theoretical persuasion of social constructionism, this issue around a scientific community that's charged, that's really trying to grapple with what is this issue, what is this product, should we be reacting to this? This is exactly the kind of thing that I think we should be thinking about. We should be taking time to stop, think carefully, and try and understand just what is this product, and think about, so for those of you who weren't in any of my classes while you were here, so a social constructionist perspective says that all of the issues, all of the objects that we interact with are shaped through our interactions, that they become known to us through how we understand what they are, that the problems that we see, what we understand, what we think about as important, that is something that is a social product. And so that's really the stance that I'm taking on this issue today. And I'd like to have you think through and give you some examples to think about how are we understanding the product, how are we understanding the issue, and then how are we understanding the solution? And thinking about to what extent is the public health community shaping that, to what extent is science shaping that, and to what extent are other factors shaping that. Okay, so to start off with, I'm going to just spend a little bit of time giving you some more examples of how the commercial side of this and how the tobacco companies and e-cigarette companies are helping us to understand the issue and the product, specifically thinking about how are we understanding the product. And a lot of these issues are things that have already begun to be raised. So let's see if this will...
-1.
Oh.
I'm tired of being a walking ashtray. -2. I'm tired of feeling guilty every time I want to light up. I'm Stephen Dorff. I've been a smoker for 20 years. And I just found a smarter alternative. Blue e-cigs. Blue lets me enjoy smoking without it affecting the people around me. Because it's vapor, not tobacco smoke. That means no ash. And best of all, no offensive odor. With Blue, you can smoke at a basketball game if you want to. And how about not having to go outside every 10 minutes when you're in a bar with your friends? The point is, you can smoke Blue virtually anywhere. We're all adults here. It's time we take our freedom back. Come on, guys. Rise from the ashes.
Okay. Yes. Okay, so that's a very masculine portrayal. Same product, but a very different, well, some of the very similar messages, but from a different perspective. So.
You know, I love being single, but here's what I don't love. A kiss that tastes like an ashtray. Blech. I'm Jenny McCarthy, and I finally found a smarter alternative to cigarettes. Blue e-cigs. Blue satisfies me. I get to have a Blue without the guilt because there's only vapor, not tobacco smoke. That means no ash, no odor, which also means I don't get the stink eye from others. Also, it doesn't make my hair smell, my teeth turn yellow. You get the idea. That's why I am in love with Blue e-cigs. Now that I've switched to Blue, I feel better about myself. And I feel free to have one almost anywhere. When I'm driving, at home, watching TV, or when I'm in the club. And no going outside in the rain or freezing my butt off just to take a puff. I can whip out my Blue and not worry about scaring that special someone away. You know what I'm saying? Finally with Blue, I took back my freedom.
So I think maybe some discussion about if we're thinking about the e-cigarette as an alternative product to tobacco and the possible problems with combustible use. The very limited portrayal of these is problematic. It's problematic because of the ash. It's problematic because of yellow teeth. There's no talk about carcinogens. There's no talk about health effects that we tend to focus on in hard-hitting tobacco control campaigns. So. Let me just move on. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit, widen this out to talk about some of the other contributing messages that we have about thinking about this product and the issues, but to stick just for a moment with the marketing of the product itself. We are seeing a lot of the familiar messages and things that have worked really well for cigarettes or combustible tobacco. So again, here's Stephen Dorff again with the blue, "Take Back Your Freedom." And you see, this is going back to the classic cigarettes of 60 or more years ago. Again, we start with a classic here, and it's just incredible just how similar the imagery is for these products. I don't understand this with the green lips, but it seems to work. So if somebody can tell me why it is that this would be appealing. And here's Kirk Douglas, and again, just very similar sort of images, thinking about the technology and appeals to this as a technological advance are also similar. And then, so Ryan was talking about the organic and natural. So I think you may be beat there, Ryan, sorry. But the tobacco industry, and again, I think one of the interesting issues is I think in public health we've understood the issue for a long time, that there were good guys and there were bad guys in this issue, and I think we're having to rethink that, whether it is as clear black and white anymore as to whether there is just one opponent, or is it more complicated than that? So thinking about how do we understand what the issue even is? So in addition to thinking about the product, is the product different? Should we be thinking about the product as essentially akin to a cigarette, or should we be thinking about it differently? Should we be thinking about it, can we still think about it as in relation to tobacco, or are we beyond that? Should we be thinking in harm reductions terms? How should we be thinking about this in terms of danger? How should we be thinking about this in terms of glamour? And as I said, thinking about the complexity around the producers of the product. And then there's the issue around the behavior itself. So I think it's really interesting, and when you look at some of the websites from the creation of this new term, to vape rather than to smoke. And if you look at the American Vaping Association website, it's clearly distinguishing between vaping and differentiating it from smoking. And so thinking about, well, do we want to push back on that? What is the reality of the difference between these two behaviors, or does it behoove us to actually to sort of grasp that and run with it? So thinking about vapors, if we have vaping, just like we have smoking, then we have vapors rather than smokers. And what is our image of those people? And how do we want to learn from our experience in the past of, the idea of creating outcasts or stigmatizing smokers? What do we want to do in relation to vaping? So understanding the behavior and thinking about that critically. And then finally, and this is understanding the nature of the problem. And we've talked, I think, a lot already today about the differences and our increasing understanding about the nature of the problem. So are we in a situation where this isn't a problem for public health? It's a possible phenomenal solution. Is this around quitting? Is the issue really around quitting? Or is this something that the idea of dual use or prevention of quitting or prevention or a delay of quitting? Thinking about this in relation to regulation or an unregulated product. We hear in the news media about this being the Wild West. We hear discussions of the need for more science, but then how do we get that science given the uncertainty in the community? Thinking about getting kids hooked, thinking about poisonous product components, and then again thinking about the producers of the product and whether or not that is big tobacco and keeping up with the extent to which that's changing. and the idea that the sort of changing role of big tobacco in this. So my final point then, before moving on to my colleagues, is that in relation to media and the influence of the news media, I talked a little bit about marketing. In media theory, we talk about two real influences of media. One, the idea that the media can be really influential in setting the agenda, determining what it is that we think is important, where we're turning our attention. And right now, e-cigarettes are absolutely critically, they're on the agenda, and thinking about, well, how did they get there, and how, if this is important, do we want to take time to make and make energy, not make energy, expend energy in making sure that they don't slip off the agenda before we've come to a consensus about a set of policy solutions. And then finally, this issue around framing. How is it that people understand the product, the problem, and the solution, and who are the players, who are the stakeholders in that process? Clearly, and in public health, we're very used to having some very well-funded, some very strong sort of opponents in that framing, but how do we do the best job that we can in making sure that we are at the table and that we are contributing in a helpful and effective way to helping people understand the problem, helping people understand the multiple possible solutions. So, thanks.
Great. Carl Latkin, who's also a professor in our department, is going to talk about harm reduction issues and parallels to...
Sure. I don't know if there's anything left to talk about after Dave's great talk. I guess I'll talk about a couple things. One would be the lessons learned from HIV and substance use harm reduction, and then issues of health disparities and harm reduction. I think from HIV, what we've learned is a couple things. First of all, that when we're thinking about harm reduction, the opposite side is going to focus on the unanticipated risks. You know, are syringes, does that encourage people to use drugs? But I think we can't get caught up in that because we can present lots of data to show it doesn't, but that doesn't necessarily move policy. So I think as scientists, we can't get hooked into that just science alone is going to change policy. On the other hand, I think what we also know from harm reduction is if we're scientists and we use sloppy words, if we're not very precise, the other side, whoever that is, will use it against us. With needle exchange, there were some studies in Canada that they found some HIV increase, cross-sectional studies. The authors of those studies had no idea that that data would be used against needle exchange, but it just set it back because they didn't think about when they took their data, they published it, they sort of wrote their discussion, not offhanded, but not thinking about the unintended negative consequences of what they wrote. It really did a disservice. So I think in the scientific community, we sort of have to think, how will our words be used and abused? A third thing about harm reduction is it's pretty commonly accepted now that harm reduction isn't you give drug users syringes, you give them drug treatment, you change policies. I think we've come to the place where we see it's a comprehensive package. And so when we're looking at harm reduction in e-cigarettes, we have to say this has to be a comprehensive package. It has to be policy. It has to be access. It has to be marketing. So let's not get fixed on one point because then we spend all our energy and sort of say yes or no, did this work? When in fact, that's really, we know public health has to be flexible. It has to be comprehensive. And we can't just narrow in on one approach. One thing I think we want to think about in harm reduction is what is harm reduction? And I think one sort of more simple approach is, if you look at utilitarianism, it's sort of Jeremy Bentham, individual level good. If I use this product, am I going to reduce my personal harm? I think as public health practitioners and researchers, we need to have a more sophisticated approach, sort of John Stuart Mill's, what is the greatest good for the population? And that sounds nice. However, then you have to say which population? Your population, my population. Your folks out in the suburbs or walk a block away. So a block away, what's people's housing like? A block away, most people smoke. a block away, if you smoke in a row house, everybody gets a high level of exposure. Is it the same in your house? So I think when we're thinking about the issue of harm reduction, we really have to think about vulnerable populations. So what if we make our e-cigarettes expensive and we find out they're effective for reducing tobacco, reducing cigarettes? So if folks a block away cannot afford them, the people who need them the most are not going to get access to them. You know, there's talk about Lucy's. People a block away get a lot of their cigarettes from buying single cigarettes. But if the e-cigarettes cost $7, even the cheapest, are we, in fact, impeding their access to e-cigarettes? So I think also we can't think about just a unitary group of individuals. We have to think about vulnerable populations. What's going to be available for them? How do we make policies so vulnerable populations may have access to harm reduction approaches such as e-cigarettes, whereas it's not increasing use in other populations? Also in Baltimore, there's a lot of fires associated with cigarette use. So that may not be true out in the county. What do we do about that? How do we have people using products that reduce the chances of fire without increasing tobacco utilization or cigarette use utilization? Another thing I think when we think about public health and a danger for us is thinking about relative risk versus absolute risk. And I think Dave did a great job of presenting some of the information on some of the secondhand smoke from e-cigarettes. But I've also heard people say, oh, well, they have toxins. Well, that's sort of the absolute approach to cigarettes and public health. Walking outside, you may get hit by lightning. But I think we really have to get away from, are there dangers of e-cigarettes? Yes, there are dangers. We have to get away from the absolute approach of harm and look at the relative approach. Are e-cigarettes better than what people will do? And obviously, as people pointed out, there's pluses and minuses. We don't want cigarette use increasing. But I think in this discussion, we really have to think about vulnerable populations who have very high levels of tobacco use, cigarette use, have very high levels of secondhand smoke exposure, and don't have the access to resources, and do not use quitting. They don't call cessation lines. They rarely use current cessation techniques. How do we get them involved in the conversation, and how do we address their public health issues and reduce tobacco consumption or cigarette consumption in really the most vulnerable populations? Thanks.
Okay, well, now there really is nothing more to add. So I'll just say a few words. I was asked to speak about the end game of tobacco control, and I'll say what that is in a moment. But if you go back 25, 30 years, who would have thought we would have smoke-free restaurants and bars? And if we go back just a few years, who would have thought we would have picture warnings on cigarette packs, even in countries like Pakistan? And today, who would have thought we would have plain and standardized packaging with no branding on it whatsoever? And we have that in Australia. And who would have thought that we would not display tobacco products at a retailer, and we have that coming up even in Russia. So we have made great progress in tobacco control. We've, with a lot of with great science, with a lot of expert advocates who know what they're doing, and with changing social norms, we've been able to accomplish a lot. And that's why in tobacco control we talk about the end game. So where are we headed, and how do we get to those very low prevalence rates of tobacco use? So for example, how do we get to 5% prevalence and below? And some people say because, if you connect the dots, because if we can get there, maybe we can even get to prohibiting the product altogether. We're not in a position where we can do that now because the negative consequences would be too large. So the end game is thinking about the future. How do we get rid of tobacco-caused death and disease? And one of the things that's really exciting about e-cigarettes to me is that we can really expand our approaches for in public health. So many of you have heard of the epidemiologic triangle. So we have, at one apex the host, and another the environment. We have the vector in the middle, and the other apex of the triangle is the agent. And in tobacco control, we really haven't done much around the agent to date. We have fire-safe cigarettes. We've banned flavors now, but we really haven't taken advantage of that public health strategy of dealing with the agent in addition to the the agent in addition to the host and the environment and the vector. So this is an opportunity to think about how agent-related interventions can help get to the end of the epidemic. With the announcement, was it last week from so much is changing on like an hourly basis. So it was very interesting. So up until the announcement that we had from the FDA recently, people were talking about e-cigarettes as a smoking cessation device or as sort of a harm-reducing product or a safer product. And now it's clear. We had the director of the Center for Tobacco Products make an announcement, and not the director of the Center of CEDAR, or the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. So it's a little bit clearer now, the way forward. We're not looking at e-cigarettes as a smoking cessation device in terms of our regulatory approach in this country. Now it's a tobacco product, and we're thinking about it as a harm reduction product. So that's huge. I mean, that's the big change now. It's sort of cut off the pharmaceutical aspect. Now we can still do that, but now it was the Center for Tobacco Products that was announcing about e-cigarettes. So if we're now within the context of harm reduction, so the idea is, well, if smokers can't stop using the most harmful product, we've heard a lot about that already, so can they use something much less harmful? And we have experience about this in tobacco control. We have the low-tar, light, mild cigarette. We've had Eclipse, we've had dissolvables, we've had snus and lozenges, and now e-cigarettes. And dissolvables, snus, I mean, there's use, but they haven't really taken off. As opposed, with light and low tar cigarettes, that has been a huge sort of deception. Low tar cigarettes are a huge deception, and public health, was part of the problem. So back in, when we learned what was harmful with cigarettes, it was the tar. And so you say, okay, if the tar is harmful, let's have less tar. And everyone was on board with that, and the tobacco companies came up with so-called low tar cigarettes. It was all a fraud, and it was just that the smoking machine smoked low tar cigarettes in a certain way. The companies put holes in the filters so it diluted the smoke, and we thought these are low tar cigarettes. And where we thought we were doing good for the population by giving them a safer alternative, less tar, because tar is harmful, what happened is we caused more harm because smokers thought they were smoking something safer. They didn't quit. Also, we saw patterns of disease change. So because it was a bit harder to get the nicotine fix when air is being diluted, diluting the nicotine coming into your lungs, people would take more puffs, inhale more deeply, and we're seeing much lower lung cancers in people now, and more lethal lung cancers. So I think, we all want to do good. Everyone wants to do the right thing, but we have to be careful because you can't just say because one thing is bad, if we get rid of that, we're going to solve a problem. So are e-cigarettes the holy grail? Are they what we're looking for in terms of, focusing on the agent apex of the epidemiologic triangle? Are they, less harm in terms of delivering nicotine? Or is it going to be another low-tar fiasco? Or, because most things are never black or white, are we going to be somewhere in between? And are we going to be in a place where we have a product that some people switch to from their regular cigarettes, so they completely switch. Some people are going to dual use. They're going to continue to use their cigarettes and use e-cigarettes. And, and some people are going to start using products, including youth. So we'll probably be there. It's probably going to be somewhere in between where we're going to end up. So in terms of thinking about whether e-cigarettes are part of the end game or not, whether they'll be the disruptive technology that gets us to 5% smoking prevalence or lower, there are a lot of things we have to find out. We have to understand who is actually going to switch to e-cigarettes and stay switched, or maybe eventually get off nicotine altogether, but at least switch completely. And as Carl mentioned, who doesn't? Who doesn't switch? Who are the smokers who aren't going to switch? And we have to understand that very well. And of course, all the health effects and risks, health implications of dual use, et cetera. But if the risks, David Abrams is really clear. This is not a combustible product. Going head to head of e-cigarettes and a combustible cigarette, these aren't going to be as harmful for the individual. So if the risks are low, the question is, how much do we actually encourage use? Or not. And so David sort of talked about a lot of things, but he talked about a continuum of harm in thinking of regulating tobacco or nicotine and tobacco products. And if e-cigarettes, in his graph, they're sort of at the safer end of the graph in terms of toxicity. Do we actually work to encourage their use? And Ryan talked about the different types of regulatory approaches we can use to either encourage or discourage use. So, we've heard that some countries are trying to regulate them like cigarettes. Maybe we have to think about increasing their availability and accessibility instead of reducing it. So maybe what we do want is aggressive marketing and promotion. Maybe what we do want are low prices. Maybe what we do want are high nicotine concentrations to help people switch in terms of harm reduction. So I certainly I'm not the person who has the answers, and I think our charge, and I think everyone here this afternoon, our charge was to sort of get discussion going and put out ideas. So I know my colleagues have done that, so I think we're just going to open it up to comments and questions.
And I apologize, we're using the microphones because this is being webcast. Thank you.
So this is a question for Kate, and this might be completely naive. I also missed your first ad, so you might have already answered this question. But the content of the ads that you showed seemed to me to be marketing particularly to current smokers, people who may feel that the smoking regulations have constrained their freedoms and are mad about it, so they should take back their freedom and smoke wherever they want using e-cigarettes. Have you seen marketing that is targeting never smokers or kids?
I think that's interesting. When I watch those ads, I think that they are instructing smokers how to tell people how to think about this, that this is a product that you can use where you can't use combustibles. They're giving them lines to give people as well, I think. But I also would argue that the health claims that they're talking about there are actually ones that in our consideration of marketing are ones that are very concerning to younger people. So the yellowing of teeth and the smelling like smoke, to me, that's not something that most people in their, that's something that that's what you see in sort of fairly naive ads aimed at kids. So I think there's actually some pretty interesting messaging there that could be understood in relation to things that are important to younger smokers.
Hi. So I had a question about something I thought of as a potential unintended consequence of e-cigarettes. So previously there was a lot of discussion around banning the use of menthol as an additive in cigarettes, and it's a form to potentially maybe reduce the prevalence of smoking around for African Americans who are more likely to smoke menthol. So is it the possibility that now offering e-cigarettes with menthol flavorings, that now those smokers who would have quit smoking altogether are now just going to switch to e-cigarettes? So even if e-cigarettes are less harmful than combustible cigarettes, they're still probably more harmful than not smoking or vaping or anything at all. So could that be a potential unintended consequence of now encouraging people to use e-cigarettes? And I wanted to see what you guys thought of that.
Yes, certainly. Well, we haven't banned menthol from cigarettes yet, so unfortunately we're not in that position yet, but I think you're exactly right. It's the example of the low-tar cigarettes. Quit or use a different product, right? And if there's a product that seems attractive, people will do that.
Is there data yet concerning the use by different groups and age groups as well, based on certain flavors? I know that if you go to a vape shop, you can find 5 zillion flavors, like gummy bear and chocolate milk. But as far as the major manufacturers go that offer menthol and cherry crush and flavors like that, has data come in yet relating to age groups who are using those particular flavors?
It's slowly, we're still learning how to even ask questions about e-cigarettes. It's really challenging, and I think you've heard in the news recently, kids are using all different kinds of names and not e-cigarettes, so we're still partly learning how to ask about that properly. But David, go ahead.
There's a little bit. Legacy's been collecting some data fairly rapidly. We are seeing that younger men seem to be more attracted to e-cigarettes in general, which is sort of what you'd expect, perhaps. On the flavoring, I'm not aware that we have anything specific yet, but we are tracking it. One of the interesting things you said, though, is, you see, it depends how you want to thread the needle. If a lot of people who use menthol, and there is actually evidence that it is more appealing to get youth hooked, especially African Americans, because it's milder, and as somebody said, it makes the poison go down a little more easily. And there's evidence from TIPSAC and the reviews that it's harder for menthol smokers to quit smoking. So if you're targeting wanting to get menthol smokers who are having trouble quitting to a much less harmful product, you could argue that what you actually want to do is ban menthol in combusted cigarettes and leave it in e-cigarettes until lots of people switch completely. And then you can sort of regulate e-cigarettes, especially if e-cigarettes, they're not a little bit less harmful, they are dramatically less harmful. So I'm more concerned with getting people off combusteds. And so this is where you get into this tricky thing where flavors may help be more attractive to smokers, but flavors are attractive to kids, and you don't want kids using them. So this is where the public health conflicts, start coming in. WHO has said they will ban candy flavors, but not all flavors. So they're defining flavors that are particularly egregiously appealing to kids, where adults don't necessarily need gummy bear, for example, but obvious. And then the third thing is the industry's not monolithic either. We actually have data that we just released this week on advertising and marketing, where we found that, for example, it's as you'd expect. The big tobacco companies are using all the same tactics, not necessarily the others. Blue has 40-50% of the market. It's funded by Lorillard. They far and away are spending millions on advertising. In fact, I think more than all the other companies combined. And when we reviewed where they're spending it, they are 40 to 50% targeting channels and programs that appeal to kids during times that kids are watching. Whereas, for example, Enjoy is less than 6% targeting. And those are generic things. They only got 6% because they had a couple of ads, I think, at the Globe, the Oscars, so that counted as family. But Blue clearly is going after young adults, and they would deny, and they both have the same manifesto: we don't advertise to kids. So you look at Blue and you look at Enjoy, they both say the same things. Blue is lying about it, and Enjoy is being honest, basically. Huh?
So does RDR and PM say the same.
Yeah, so as I said, I do not trust big tobacco, but be careful, because, and there are plenty of e-cigarette companies that are following big tobacco mindlessly because they think they have to compete to get market share, which if you're a business person, that's what you have to do. Enjoy and a couple of others are taking the high ground. They said they will not use flavors, and they only market to adult smokers. They're not trying to get kids, and we actually have evidence that that's true in their ads. So it's, as you said, it's complicated.
So I had a question that was probably germane to Ryan's discussion, but now that the panelists here, everyone might have it. So it's more a framing regulation, high-up-ish question, which is, so when you think of regulation, the standard econ way of thinking of it is regulation is good, regulation is needed, regulation has externalities, so things that you do in Canada can be copied in Pakistan, and you have a good set of pack laws or of pack images. Regulation is also costly because it takes time and it has to be scientifically done. It takes, and regulation can have unintended consequences. So it's complex, it's needed. So in terms of my question to you, so it looks as if for e-cigarettes, like for any other products, there'd be two sets of issues. One, around the product itself, so the safety analog of, is your helmet as safe as it could be? And two, the use, so everything that we think about preventing kids from coming to contact with cigarettes and on all those, the crude but effective ways of thinking of regulation. So where do you see A, research energy, and B, policy energy going into over the next few years into these? Because one of them is technical, it's interesting, it's important, and it's probably a lot, also requires research monies. The second is big policy, big picture, crude but effective, and it might also may or may not work. So is there a balance? Are there lessons from other parts of tobacco that translate into e-cigarettes?
Well, I mean, I'll start. I think what Carl said about the work that he does, a comprehensive approach is always important, and in tobacco control, that's the first thing we say. So I would certainly not advocate that all our attention, which is, and David, you might have some ideas about how this is feeding into the tobacco industry goals as well. If we put all our energy and our discussions on e-cigarettes, we're ignoring all the other great things. We're not doing our picture warnings on packs here. We're not doing continuing smoke-free public places. We're not doing all the other things, increasing the taxes. All these things take work, and we can only do so much and put our energy into so many things. And I think we always have to be careful about getting sidetracked in tobacco control, and this is important. It's really fascinating. Everyone wants to talk about it, but we have to keep on track as well and stick with our comprehensive approach. And so there's still a lot to do with what we know works from a policy perspective.
So I have the microphone, so I'm going to use it. I have a question I want to follow up with the question you raised. I may have missed this in your presentation, David, but what is the evidence to date, even preliminarily, that suggests or does not suggest that persons who have quit smoking are now starting to use e-cigarettes. You know, so is there this sense that, because it was kind of what I thought I heard was, you know, there's this potential that if someone has stopped using, that, you know, who has quit using combustibles is now going to take up e-cigarettes. And that's a little bit of a, feels like to me, a little bit of a stretch. And so I'm just curious about the evidence to date to suggest that that is either true or not true, or going in that direction or going away from that direction.
Do you have evidence, David? I don't have evidence.
It's like I'm the fourth wheel on this three-legged stool here. So there is a little bit of evidence that a small group of former smokers are using e-cigarettes from the CDC tracking data. It's fairly small. However, we can't distinguish whether when they say I'm a former smoker and an e-cigarette user, we don't know actually if they quit recently using e-cigarettes or whether they're like a long-term former smoker. And I don't think we can tease that apart because surveys haven't even asked the questions appropriately yet because we're only just gearing up to put the right questions in our surveys. So I don't think it's cause for an alarm. And then there are two things here. To be really problematic, and of course, I think the recommendation should be no one who's quit smoking and is doing fine without it should be thinking, oh my gosh, clean nicotine, let me start using again. As much as I would like to do that, I'm not going to do it. But that's a public health problem because it could result in a fairly large group of former smokers starting to get their brains humming with nicotine again. And here's the danger is, do they progress back to combusted cigarettes, which would be a major public health disaster if proportionately more of those people did than people quitting and staying quit from combustibles and kids starting and progressing to combustibles. So if you put those three numbers together, and it's fairly easy to do in a couple of differential equations and modeling, which in fact we're doing, you can begin to use the data to populate modeling to see what the overall net public health impact of different uptakes and transitional probabilities and so on. So we've got to do that research, and we're just at the beginning of it. There are certainly things to be worried about, and we've got to be very vigilant, and it's what I said is, you know, all of this is canary in the coal mine kind of stuff, but we can't knee-jerk either and have preliminary data that we panic about, because you've got to remember e-cigarettes are less harmful. You could almost argue, and I think David said this beautifully on the on-ramp and the off-ramp. I really love that. I'm going to use that at some point. But if, let's say, kids start with e-cigarettes and they love them, they may never progress to combustibles, and if they're less addictive, more of them may be able to grow out of it at age 25 because they're not addicted. So is it a gateway or an off-ramp in that sense, or an on-ramp? We've got to be careful with our regulations that we don't overly encourage or discourage while tracking and educating the public to maximize the benefits and minimize the harms. And it's not easy because I think you've got to thread this needle very carefully in every aspect. And I don't think colleagues are doing that. I think it's like blind people and the elephant. They're looking at one thing and they're overemphasizing it and not thinking about the other feedback loops and systems in the overall public health equation, as I think Carl and others on the panel talked about. So again, I think it's complicated.
So I just wanted to make a comment that your armed forces in this country, i.e. the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, we have policies. The Army has a public health command, and Dr. Latkin is kind of our conduit with your School of Public Health and our public health command. But half of our military is between the ages of 18 and 26. And in the Army alone, Our strength is about 500,000. So we're talking about 250,000 young people that if you help design how to do some studies to affect, or that needs to look at some of the statistics on young people, we're your partners to help make that happen, because there's nothing like a protracted war to do the only legal drug out there downrange when you're in combat. And so regardless of whether you come in at 18, just out of high school, or you come in right after college as an officer, the tobacco product you choose may look different between cigar smoking and cigarette smoking, and your ethnic group may influence that. But somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of our armed forces are using tobacco products of one kind or another. And downrange is our biggest risk factor. When we deploy people downrange, they tend to either restart or pick up tobacco use. So I just encourage you, if as you go forward in your creative thinking about how do we get the data, how do we design some studies to answer some of these questions, we're a partner in that, and we'd like to collaborate. Our medical treatment facilities consider electronic smoking devices right now the same as tobacco products in the therapeutic campus area, and where children live, learn, and play is our next kind of sphere of influence, where we really have targeted no tobacco products of any kind to include the electronic smoking devices. But I have to tell you, there's nobody like a service member to feel like the infringement of their rights, their fundamental right, whether it's fostered by tobacco lobbies or these ads, and it gives a real mixed message. So I just kind of, as the chief nurse of the Army's Public Health Command, I throw out the gauntlet to collaborate with you all as you look for study populations and perhaps some opportunities for engagement to look at the way ahead to include special diversity populations that are specific, whether it's African Americans, Native Americans, or whatever. Thank you.
So my dissertation research is about tobacco outlet density, and Dr. Cohen wrote a paper in 2009, Outlet Density, the New Frontier, and it has inspired my work. So when Dr. Latkin mentioned access and vulnerable communities, I can't help but to think about tobacco outlets. Baltimore City is inundated with tobacco outlets, and at the end of the day, public health advocates and researchers like me are saying reduce outlet density. It's related to smoking, and smoking risk will go down. But now, if the push is for e-cigarettes as this harm reduction approach and mass advertisement and mass promotion of it, is it going to counteract efforts to reduce tobacco outlet density and in the most vulnerable communities, like low-income Black communities such as Baltimore City? That's my comment. Any thoughts about that?
What's your paper? 2009?
Meaning the thinking happened like way before that. Yeah, exactly. And I mentioned the idea of availability and accessibility as a huge driver of our behavior in terms of use of consumer products. So, I mean, those are just the tools we can use if we want to increase availability and accessibility to promote a behavior, or decrease it to discourage a behavior. So, I mean, these are the big questions that we have to ask. Now, with things like NRT, we wanted to encourage use of NRT, and people argued, put it in this, get it, first of all, from pharmacies, from behind the counter to in front of the counter, and now get it into the 7-Elevens, get it, increase the accessibility. What's fascinating now is what we find is NRT isn't working very well at the population level, because generally when you when you go from a clinical trial to using a drug in a population level, you don't get the same effects. But people aren't using it properly. They don't get to talk to a pharmacist about how exactly you're supposed to bite on the gum as opposed to chew the gum, and how long you're supposed to use it. And so so sometimes, again, public health, we want to do good, we're thinking we're doing good, and sometimes we might not have the best effect that we might otherwise have. So I completely agree. We have to be very careful about how we use our levers of influence to encourage or discourage certain behaviors. But I don't know.
I could be opening up a whole nother conversation, but Dr. Abrams touched on hookah briefly. And if we don't regulate the flavors of e-cigarettes, is there a concern that this could link to or encourage children to smoke hookah, which obviously is an increasing problem now?
Yeah. So FDA's deeming, we were somewhat disappointed that they did not regulate or restrict marketing to kids or restrict flavors in little cigars, cigarillos, hookah, or e-cigarettes. So Mitch said that this is a first step in the deeming, and you've got to, this is, to your point, regulation takes time. And it's also, remember, in this litigious society, especially with big tobacco, if FDA doesn't take its time, make sure the science is right and all the procedures are followed, they'll get killed in court challenges. So while we're disappointed, I think they intend to collect the data to show that flavorings do attract kids, and that because Congress in its wisdom banned flavorings in regular cigarettes, there's a precedent to ban flavors other than menthol, which I happen to think ought to have been banned by now, but that's a whole nother story. And we have enough evidence as well, but it ain't going to happen for political and other reasons. I think we are worried about flavors in hookah as well as in little cigars and cigarillos, which are popular, loosies, and inexpensive, and particularly are aggressive starter products because they are addictive, they are combusted, and if we're worried, to me, I'd be more worried still about them while being vigilant about e-cigarettes. So the other piece here is very interesting. R.J. Reynolds has just appointed a new CEO, and she was the one that talked about Reynolds being a, quote, full-service tobacco company. Now, I don't know if you know this, but while big farmers drag their feet and doesn't want to package their NRTs in smaller packs that are inexpensive and put them in mom and pop convenience stores because they made a corporate decision that drug companies don't do that. They don't want to be associated with putting their products from a drug company in a convenience store, so they won't do it. Well, guess what? I don't know if you know this, but R.J. Reynolds bought a drug company called Niconovum. They developed a smoking cessation lozenge called Zonic. They got it approved by CEDA at FDA, and they're selling it for less than $3 in little lozenges of 5 or 10 in mom and pop stores all over the country. So to me, the joke I usually make here, this is like Dunkin' Donuts and Weight Watchers merging and having a Dunkin' Donuts right next to a Weight Watchers store, so you just keep circulating. Now, so they're making money selling smoking cessation. They're a full-service nicotine tobacco company. They really don't care. So 2 reasons why they're doing that from a business model. They know that NRTs don't work very well, so they're not really cannibalizing their cessation products that much. And most people who go into a gas station and fill up and want to grab a few lozenge are probably using them as a bridge product, just as we feared, because they're going to a meeting, they can't smoke, they don't want to be in withdrawal. So regardless of the fact that this is, quote, a smoking cessation aid and it's approved by FDA, who says they won't use it as a bridge product? So again, it's complicated.
Let me just go back to the flavor issue and sort of a plug for Ryan's talk and his perspective. So in this country at this time, we're not banning flavors, but there are a lot of other countries. And we might be able to learn a lot from what's going on in other parts of the world and hopefully inform the policy discussion here.
Yeah. The Tobacco Act of the US banned characterizing flavors, except menthol. It didn't ban flavorants. So if we put our hat on about regulation and we sort of take David's advice in terms of thinking of things holistically, what we probably can achieve is not just regulating the e-cigarette, but in tandem regulating the regular cigarette. So we don't have to just wait for the e-cigarette to get better. We can use legislation that we have right now to require that the traditional cigarettes are less appealing. We can require, we can regulate everything except eliminating the nicotine. And we have evidence. We know that these additives are put in cigarettes. Not just what's in it, but the engineering, the paper porosity, the acidity. That we can regulate those things, and we can thereby, across the board, make cigarettes less appealing. And if we sort of do that, we're going to accelerate how these other less harmful products will be more and more appealing, because it's a relative moving target then. So that doesn't really address hookah, but it's in the same context. One of the reasons that hookah is appealing is the flavors and its experience and the sort of the chemosensory experience someone has taking that full puff on the hookah, and the particle size being such that they're able to inhale it deeply. And I haven't seen an e-cigarette hookah. Is there? Yeah, there is. Yeah, it's still using the product. It's just not the charcoal.
It's just labeled as a mini hookah.
Yeah.
It's just an e-cigarette with colored paper.
Yeah, it's but it's not fair trade.
But that's a critical point. If I could just jump up again. I started my talk with the Surgeon General's report and Mitch Zeller's single most important statement, and that is, harm reduction will only work in the context of making the most addictive, lethal, combusted product less attractive, less appealing, way more costly, and less addictive. And it's that's really the driver that takes advantage of harm reduction. It's not so much the e-cigarette that you want to wait to be more attractive, it's to make the cigarette less attractive. And I don't think we should be distracted from that. It's actually everything we've been doing for 50 years. We should keep doing with the full force of everything we've done before, targeted at the cigarette. But I do think in this climate of the e-cigarette, there's a window right now for changing culture and norms, as you were talking about. And we may lose it if we don't act soon, because big tobacco will redefine the frame of how people think about e-cigarettes as poly-fun use dual products, not to quit, but to reduce your harm a little bit, because now you're smoking 17 cigarettes a day instead of 21. And that's all an addictive smoker wants to hear, that I can keep smoking. So we're in a very slippery slope here with the sociology of all of this, as Kate was saying. And I think we're missing a window of opportunity, and we are feeding into big tobacco's framing and defining the cultural debate here of poly-use as the new behavior.
Well, and I guess if I could piggyback on that, David, I think while as a scientific community we're still working out to fully understand the nature of the problem and the nature of the e-cigarette as part of the problem, we shouldn't completely lose sight that we know a lot about the solution. And the solution, the vast majority of the solution, needs to be around the things that we have been working on, as Joanna said, for a very, very long time now, and are making great strides.
I think that was, unfortunately for time, probably our last question, but please join me in thanking the panel again. It's a terrific discussion.